Hey, Aron Bernstein here. Are you going stir crazy? Just hanging out all the time in the tonic key? Well, I've got a chord for you that was made for modulation. It's kind of a harmonic grand central station, easily taking you to remote keys. And in this video, I'll show you how to use it. All aboard! Say hello again to the all-purpose chord, the diminished 7th. This thing may be the sonic equivalent of confusion and anger, and just having a rotten day, but that very quality allows it to slip effortlessly into different keys. Just for starters, this B diminished 7th can resolve to C minor, E flat major, F sharp minor, or A major, all at the drop of a hat. So the diminished 7th is a great tool for modulation. Let's take a closer look. There are some chords that are made up of only one kind of interval. Keep stacking minor thirds on top of each other, and you get the diminished 7th chord. Then add one more minor third, and we hit the octave. We're back to our starting note. So, being made only of minor thirds, the diminished 7th chord is symmetrical, and that makes it behave in special ways. For one thing, there are only 3 diminished 7th chords. Here's the one built on G. You can transpose it up a half step to G sharp, and again to A. But transpose it up one more half step, and we just repeat the same pitches we started with. A diminished 7th built on A sharp is the same thing as the one built on C sharp, E, and back to G. Every inversion gives you the same intervals. So you can only transpose this chord 3 times, unlike the other 7th chords, which each have 12 transpositions. Now this symmetry is also what makes the diminished 7th chord so good for modulation. And if you go diminished, you go Beethoven. Beethoven made superb use of the diminished 7th as a modulation tool. In the first measure, he has an F-sharp diminished 7th, which resolves comfortably to G minor. But in the next measure, that same diminished 7th ends up in the key of E minor. Notice it's been respelled with D sharp. So let's see how the same diminished 7th chord can end up in different keys. For clarity, I'm going to simplify things a little. I'm going to keep this quarter note on C, then I'm going to move the B natural to here. I've made these slight changes just to more clearly illustrate the way Beethoven exploits the diminished 7th chord. Later on, I'll put it all back and show you the extra finesse of his original.
You better.
As you know, in any key, the 7 diminished chord is often used as a substitute for 5-7. In G minor, your 5-7 chord is a D7. Notice that the upper 3 notes form the 7 diminished triad, and it resolves just as convincingly to 1. 5-7 to 1, 7 diminished to 1. And add a 7th to your leading tone triad, you get a fully diminished 7th chord. Now in G minor, the leading tone diminished is an F-sharp diminished 7th chord. It'll easily take you to 1, G minor. But we now know the diminished 7th is symmetrical, and this F-sharp diminished 7th will invert into an A diminished 7th, a C diminished 7th, and an E flat diminished 7th. Now, if we respell that E flat as D sharp, this chord now becomes the leading tone diminished 7th in the key of E minor. And that's how Beethoven ends up in 2 different keys with the same diminished 7th chord. First, he uses it as 7 diminished of G minor, then as 7 diminished of E minor. Let's zoom in on Beethoven's voice leading. Here's 7 diminished of G minor again, but how do we know it's F sharp diminished 7th and not A diminished, C diminished, or E flat diminished? After all, we just saw how any of these notes could function as the root. The answer is in the spelling. Here's the chord in close position, and we can tell just by the look of it that it's in some sort of inversion. There's a second in there, E flat to F sharp. In a moment, we'll respell that as a minor third, but E flat to F sharp is actually an augmented second. Whenever you see that interval in a diminished seventh chord, the top note in that second is the chord's root. We get this bad boy into root position, all thirds, and we see that it is in fact an F-sharp diminished seventh chord. So put it back the way Beethoven had it, and it's in second inversion, 7 diminished with 4-3 in the figured bass. Or in chord symbols, it's F-sharp diminished seventh over C. Now for the voicing. Beethoven gives the root, F-sharp, to the tenor, the third, A, to the alto, the bass takes the fifth, C, and our elegant soprano sings the seventh, E-flat. Let's check out our tendency tones. The tenor has T, and the bass has Fa. Just like in a 5-7 chord, you want to resolve those correctly. So T steps up to Do, and Fa sinks to Me. That gives us the root and the third of our G minor chord. And because the bass has the third, we can see that it's in first inversion, 1-6. The soprano has lay, and that drops to so, the fifth of our G minor chord. Finally, the alto doubles the third, me, approaching this B flat from the opposite direction as the bass, so no voice leading trouble here. Now comes the fun part, enharmonic spelling. Who doesn't love enharmonics? Why call this key G when you could call it F double sharp? Fortunately, Beethoven doesn't do anything so egregious here.
Wait a while.
He just renames this E-flat D-sharp. But that does change things a bit. Even though this diminished seventh chord sounds the same, F-sharp is no longer the root. The top note in this augmented second is D-sharp, so that's now the root. This is a D-sharp diminished seventh chord, and it's in third inversion, so the figured bass would be 7-4-2 of E minor, or D-sharp diminished seventh over C. Now we look at the voice leading. Our soprano has the root, D sharp. The tenor's on third, F sharp. The alto has the fifth, A. And the bass now has the seventh, C. Tendency tone time. The soprano has T, and the alto has Fa. And you know how to resolve those. T up to Do, and Fa down to Me. That gives us the root and the third of our E minor chord. The tenor has Re, F sharp, and that steps down and doubles Do. Finally, the bass has Lay, C, which steps down to So. That puts our E minor chord in second inversion, so we've resolved this 7 diminished chord to 1-6-4. And there you have it. By enharmonically reinterpreting this diminished seventh chord, we can make it resolve to G minor or to E minor. All right, a quick recap. A single diminished seventh chord can function as 7 diminished, or leading tone diminished, in 4 different keys. That's because, thanks to the chord's symmetry, any one of its 4 notes can be the root. An A-sharp diminished seventh would be 7 diminished in B minor, but invert it and C-sharp becomes the root. Respell the A-sharp as B-flat, and this is now a C-sharp diminished seventh, 7 diminished in D minor. Invert it again, and E becomes the root. Respell the C-sharp as D-flat, and we've got an E diminished seventh, which is 7 diminished in F minor. One more inversion, and now G is the root. Respell E as F-flat, and this is a G diminished seventh, 7 diminished in A-flat minor. Now, without those enharmonic respellings, we're going to have inversions of our diminished seventh chord. Let's go back to the first one, A-sharp diminished. In root position, of course, it's all minor thirds, but in first inversion, we get an augmented second on top. Remember, you'll see that augmented second in any diminished seventh chord that's inverted, and the top note in that augmented second is the root, A sharp in this case. Second inversion, there's the augmented second in the middle, and third inversion, it's on the bottom. Keep the top note of the augmented second in your sights, and you'll always know what the root is and which key it's the 7 diminished chord of. Now earlier I changed a couple of the bass notes in Beethoven's original sonata, just to clarify his use of the diminished seventh chord. As promised, I'll put him back. And my other bit of sacrilege. Beethoven had just a bit more sophistication here. And why?
'Cause I'm Beethoven, y'all.
Alright, here's what he did. First, he still resolved this F-sharp diminished seventh to G minor, but he made the bass resolve before the upper voices. The bass steps down to B-flat, the third of the G minor chord, but everyone else is still on that F sharp diminished 7th. They don't resolve to G minor until the next chord. So this is a delayed resolution of the upper voices, also called a retardation. And next, we resolve a D sharp diminished 7th to E minor, but Beethoven adds one extra hurdle. He drops the bass down again, this time just a half step, to B natural. Notice what this does. Our D sharp diminished 7th has turned into a B7 chord, and that of course is 5/7 of E minor. So in a diminished 7th chord, just by lowering one of the notes a half step, we get the 5/7 chord of a new key area. This is yet another way the diminished 7th can help us change keys. Here's an A diminished 7th chord. If we lower the 7th a half step, that gives us an F7, and that's the 5/7 chord in the key of B flat major, or minor. Next, what if we lower the 5th of our A diminished? We could just respell that G flat as F sharp, and now we get a D7, 5/7 in the key of G major. Try lowering the 3rd of our A diminished, and we get a B7, 5/7 of E major. Last, lower the root of the A diminished 7th chord. That gives us an A flat 7, the 5/7 chord in the key of D flat major. So in a diminished 7th chord, any note can be lowered a half step, turning it into the root of a different dominant 7th chord. 4 different notes, that's 4 different keys you can modulate to. So let's see that at work in one more example, just in case you haven't heard enough of this chord today. We've got a G sharp diminished 7th chord, which is 7 diminished in the key of A minor. So how in the world does this passage end up in E flat major? Let's go to the map. Here's our 7 diminished chord, resolving to 1, in A minor. Nothing unusual there, but Schubert doesn't want to go to 1. So he takes this G sharp diminished 7th and lowers the 3rd, B, to B flat. Reinterpret that G sharp as an A flat, and we now have a B flat dominant 7th chord, which of course is 5/7 in the new key of E flat major. So Schubert simply lowered one note in the diminished 7th chord, leading him into a completely unexpected key. And remember, he could have done this with any of the notes, giving him 4 keys to modulate to. We're back. So, the diminished 7th chord wears a lot of hats. All it takes is a bit of respelling, and it can become the 7 chord in 4 different keys. Or simply flat one of its notes, and it becomes 5/7 in a new key. Try out all the worksheets for this video lesson, and you'll get some good practice doing both. Until then, now boarding for any key you can think of.